The flatbed pulled into the lot on a Wednesday morning, which was already the wrong kind of day. Decker Holt had been up since 4:30, same as always, making lunches for his daughter before school and running through the week's invoices in his head while the coffee brewed. The garage didn't open until 7, but he was always there by 6, unlocking the bay doors, checking on whatever project had been left mid-repair the night before. It was a routine he'd built after Claire died, because routine was the only thing that kept the mornings from swallowing him whole. He was under a 2009 F-150 when he heard the truck. The sound of the air brakes, the particular groan of a heavy load settling. He'd spent enough years on factory floors to know the difference between a delivery truck and something bigger. He rolled out from under the chassis and stood, wiping his hands on a shop rag that wasn't going to do much good at that point. There were 4 of them on the flatbed, marine diesel engines. The kind you'd find in offshore racing vessels, purpose-built, extraordinarily expensive when new. They were strapped down under canvas tarps that had been done up sloppily, like whoever loaded them hadn't expected anyone to care too much about what was underneath. The driver handed him a clipboard with a delivery order. The name at the top was Harrington Maritime Holdings. The line for recipient said, "Dispose or retain, no return." "Someone's throwing these away?" Decker said. The driver shrugged. "Above my pay grade, man. You want 'em or not?" He stood there for a moment, looking at the shapes under the tarps. He pulled one back. The engine beneath was coated in salt residue and what looked like seized grime from long storage. The intake manifold was cracked on the visible side. Someone had written "condemned" in red marker across the block. But Decker Holt had spent 11 years as a senior powertrain engineer at a company whose name was still on the side of engines that competed in international racing circuits. He didn't see "condemned." He put his hand on the block, felt the quality of the casting through the grime. He knew what these were. He knew what they had been, and he had a reasonable guess about what had made them look like they weren't worth the weight of their own steel. "Leave them," he said. His daughter, Maisie, was 9 years old and had her mother's habit of asking questions at the exact moment you didn't have an answer ready. She came by the garage that afternoon, walked off the school bus at the corner, and dragged her backpack through the side door the way she always did, and stopped in the middle of Bay 2, where all 4 engines had been unloaded and arranged in a rough row. "Are those boat engines?" she asked. "Marine diesels. Yeah. Are they broken? Not the way people think." She looked at him with the particular expression she'd inherited from Claire, skeptical, patient, waiting for a better answer. "Someone decided they weren't worth fixing," he said. "I think those people were wrong." Maisie set her backpack down on the workbench stool, which she knew she wasn't supposed to do, and studied the nearest engine with the seriousness of a small person who has grown up around things being taken apart and put back together. "How much are they worth if you fix them?" she asked. Decker picked up his diagnostic tablet and didn't answer right away. He'd been running numbers in his head since the flatbed left. The marine performance market for certified rebuilt competition engines was thin but reliable. A single unit in proper working order, with documentation and dyno testing, could move for somewhere between $80,000 and $110,000, depending on buyer and application. 4 engines. "Enough," he said. What he found, once he started tearing them down, was both better and worse than he'd expected. Better. The core architecture was sound on 3 of the 4. The blocks themselves, the crankshafts, the valve geometry. Whoever had designed these had done serious work. This wasn't a commercial marine engine that had been pushed past its ratings. These were purpose-designed, overbuilt, the kind of engineering that showed up in one-off racing programs and stayed out of general circulation. Worse, they hadn't been condemned because they were worn out. They'd been condemned because someone had, deliberately and methodically, altered the maintenance records. He found the first discrepancy on a Tuesday night, 2 weeks after the engines arrived. He was cross-referencing the service hours stamped into the engine management modules against the paper logs that had been zip-tied to the delivery order. A small packet of documentation that the driver had almost not bothered handing over. The ECU on Unit 3 was reading 2,200 hours of operation. The paper log showed 400. He sat back on his stool. He pulled up Unit 2, ECU, 5,900 hours. Paper log, 350. He checked Unit 1 and Unit 4 and found the same pattern. Every engine had been made to look electronically, as though it had been run nearly to the edge of its service life. But the physical evidence didn't match. The boreware was consistent with the paper logs, not the ECU readings. Someone had manually overwritten the hour counters. It was a particular kind of fraud, and it required a particular kind of access. You couldn't do it with an off-the-shelf scan tool. You needed proprietary software and manufacturer-level credentials. Decker set down his notes and looked at the 4 engines sitting in his bay under the fluorescent lights. He thought about the name on the delivery order. Harrington Maritime Holdings. He thought about what he knew, which was more than most people would have expected. Because before the garage, and before the small town, and before Claire's illness had reoriented everything about his life. He had spent 3 years as a consultant for a marine propulsion subsidiary that had supplied engines to exactly one client in the offshore racing world. He pulled out his phone and called his old colleague, a woman named Lena Forsyth, who now worked as a compliance analyst for a racing sanctioning body based out of Annapolis. "I need to ask you something about Harrington," he said. There was a pause on her end. "Decker," she said slowly, "what do you have in front of you right now?" The name he needed was Whitmore. Gerald Whitmore had been the chief technical officer at Harrington Maritime Holdings for 6 years before departing, quietly, 18 months ago. His departure had been listed in the trade press as a retirement. Lena told him, in careful language, that the word used internally was something different. What Gerald Whitmore had done over the course of at least 3 racing seasons was systematically falsify the maintenance and certification records of Harrington's competition fleet in order to move engines through insurance claims. An engine condemned as worn out past its service life was worth its insured value, which, for a fleet of purpose-built offshore racers, was substantial. The physical engines could then be disposed of and the claim collected, except someone at Harrington had gotten sloppy or greedy or both. Instead of having the engines properly destroyed, they'd arranged to have them quietly delivered to a series of small marine salvage operations and independent shops along the eastern seaboard, with paperwork that made them untraceable. Less expensive than destruction, less conspicuous. One of those deliveries had ended up in a garage in Millhaven, North Carolina, with a man who happened to know exactly what he was looking at. "You understand what you're sitting on," Lena said. It wasn't a question. "I understand," Decker said. "Who do I call?" She gave him 2 numbers. The first was a marine fraud investigator with the NTSB. The second was an attorney she trusted, a man named Clifford Bain who had handled maritime insurance cases for 30 years and whose name she said the way people say the name of a doctor they genuinely believe saved their life. Decker wrote both numbers down on the back of an invoice for a brake job he'd finished that morning. He didn't tell Maisie all of it. She was 9, and he believed in telling her the truth about most things, but not in making a 9-year-old carry things she couldn't set down. What he told her was that the engines had a problem that wasn't a mechanic's problem, and that he was working on sorting it out, and that in the meantime they were still going to get fixed, because the mechanical problem was his to solve, and the other problem belonged to people whose job it was to handle other problems. She accepted this with the same equanimity she brought to most things. She had grown up watching her father take complicated situations and sort them into what he could do something about and what he couldn't, and she had absorbed this framework without anyone teaching it to her directly. "Are we going to get in trouble?" she asked. "No," he said. "We received them legitimately. We have the delivery paperwork." "But are they stolen?" He thought about how to answer that. They were supposed to be destroyed. Instead, someone moved them around to make a problem disappear. What I have is documentation that proves the problem didn't disappear. It just moved. And now I have an obligation to tell the right people about that. Maisie looked at him. "Because it's the right thing." "Yeah." She nodded and went back to her homework. Clifford Bain drove down from Annapolis on a Thursday in a sedan that had seen better days and a suit that hadn't. He was in his early 60s, compact and deliberate in his movements, and he had the quality that good attorneys sometimes have of listening to everything before saying anything in response. He spent 3 hours in the garage, examining the engines and the documentation Decker had compiled. He asked precise questions. He took photographs. He looked at the ECO readouts. Decker had printed and compared them against the paper logs with the attention of a man who has been reading this kind of discrepancy for a long time. When he was finished, He sat on the stool where Maisie usually did her homework and looked at Decker. "You've done my job for me," Bain said. "The chain of evidence here is clean. You received these through an identifiable freight contractor with a signed delivery order. You documented the condition on intake. Everything you found after that is recorded in sequence." He paused. "You've done this before. Engineering documentation," Decker said. "It's the same principle. You write down what you observe in order without conclusions until you have enough facts to support them." Bain nodded. "The NTSB's investigator Lena referred you to. I know him. Good man. This goes to him Monday morning. In the meantime, you don't talk to anyone at Harrington, you don't respond to any inquiries about these engines, and you don't move them." "I wasn't planning to. I know. I'm telling you anyway, because people who are doing everything right sometimes do one small thing wrong out of reasonableness. And reasonableness is how Gerald Whitmore has survived this long." He stood and put on his jacket. "There are 4 people at Harrington who know these engines exist and where they went. 3 of them work for Whitmore. The 4th is the woman who authorized the disposal." Decker waited. "Her name is Catherine Harrington," Bain said. "The company is named after her grandfather. She inherited the controlling interest 8 years ago, and has been trying to understand what's been happening in her own organization for the better part of 2 years. She's the one who shifted the disposal arrangements to independent shops instead of destruction. I believe she was buying time. Buying time for what? For someone to find what you found." He picked up his briefcase. "She's been trying to create a trail that doesn't lead back through her. Evidence that the engines existed and where they went in the hands of parties she has no relationship with." He looked at Decker. "I don't think she knew you specifically, but I think she was hoping for someone like you." The NTSB investigation moved with the particular pace of federal processes, which is to say, thoroughly and without urgency. For 6 weeks, Decker answered questions, provided documentation, and kept the engines exactly where they were. He rebuilt the other work of the garage around them, fitting brake jobs and oil changes, and a transmission overhaul for a logging company's fleet between the hours he spent preparing additional documentation at the investigator's request. He didn't hear from anyone at Harrington directly. He heard from Bain, who heard from the investigator, who heard from the Attorney General's office of 2 states, because the scheme had crossed enough jurisdictions to become a federal matter by the time all the threads were pulled. Gerald Whitmore was identified as the architect. 2 of his subordinates cooperated in exchange for consideration. The insurance claims, which totaled somewhere north of $4 million across 3 racing seasons, were the subject of a civil recovery action that Decker was not a party to and didn't need to be. What he was a party to was a conversation on a cold afternoon in February with Catherine Harrington herself. She came without announcement, or rather Bain called that morning to say she'd like to come by, and Decker had said yes, and she arrived 3 hours later in a car she drove herself. She was in her mid-40s, dark-haired, dressed in the practical way of someone who has learned that clothing is a distraction in working environments. She shook his hand without preamble and asked if she could see the engines. He showed her. She walked along the row, and her expression was not the expression of someone seeing objects. It was the expression of someone seeing the end of a long road they'd been walking in the dark. "My grandfather built the first Harrington racer in a boathouse in Beaufort," she said. "He had one rule about the boats. He said the engines were the soul, and you don't compromise the soul for anything." Decker didn't say anything. "Whitmore was in the organization for 11 years, she said. "The first 7, he was exactly what everyone believed him to be. The last 4, he was something else. By the time I understood what was happening, he'd structured things well enough that any move I made directly would have destroyed the evidence along with him." She turned to face Decker. "The disposal arrangement was the only thing I could control. I could make sure the engines went somewhere where they might be examined by someone who understood what they were." "That's a significant bet," Decker said. "I know." She looked at the engine nearest to her. "Unit 3, the one he'd nearly finished rebuilding. How are they?" "3 of the 4 will be fully operable. The 4th has block damage I can remediate, but the output won't be competition spec." "Still serviceable, different application." She nodded slowly. "They were insured for $840,000 total. Whitmore collected." She paused. "I want to make arrangements for their proper disposition." Legally, the recovery action complicates ownership. Bain is working on it. But when it's resolved, and it will be resolved, I want you to be compensated at market rate for the restoration work and for everything that came after. I was going to sell them, Decker said. That was the plan from the start. I know. I'm not asking you to give them back. I'm asking to buy them from you at a price that reflects what they actually are and what it costs to get them there. She met his eyes. Those are different numbers. The settlement of the ownership question took 4 more months. Bain earned his fee in that period and then some. The civil recovery against Whitmore's assets ran parallel and didn't resolve as quickly, but for Decker's purposes, it didn't need to. The 3 fully restored engines sold through a broker, Bain, connected him to buyers in the offshore racing community who knew exactly what they were getting and were prepared to pay for documentation and provenance. The 4th, which Decker had built out to a commercial marine application rather than competition spec, went to a charter fishing operation in Morehead City that needed reliability more than peak output. He didn't add it up exactly for a long time. It wasn't that kind of calculation. But one evening in late spring, when the bay doors were open and the last light was coming in at the angle that turned everything the color of good woodwork, Maisie was sitting on her stool doing multiplication tables, and she looked up and asked, because she was 9 and had been thinking about it for months, "Did we get enough?" Decker set down the torque wrench he'd been cleaning. He'd replaced the roof on the garage with work from that winter. He'd paid off the equipment loan he'd taken out the year Claire died, when he was still figuring out how to make the numbers work without her income. He'd put a substantial amount into Maisie's college account, the kind of amount that made the future feel like a fixed point rather than a question. There was still money in the operating account, more than there had ever been. "Yeah," he said. "We got enough." Maisie considered this. "Because you saw something other people didn't." He thought about standing in that lot on a Wednesday morning, with his hand on a cold steel block that someone had written off, feeling the quality of what was underneath the grime. "Something like that," he said. She went back to her multiplication tables. Outside, a car pulled into the lot. A regular, a man named Bud Fenwick, who brought his truck in every 6 weeks and always arrived 10 minutes before close and always apologized for it. And to whom Decker had never once said it was a problem, because it wasn't. Decker wiped his hands and went to open the door. The engines were out in the world. The bay was almost quiet. Through the office window, he could see Maisie's head bent over her homework, and the light was still good, and there was work left to do, and that was enough.